The conversation he wasn't supposed to hear lasted 11 minutes. Daniel Hartwell had come home from a work dinner earlier than expected, let himself in through the side door, and was halfway to the kitchen when he heard his wife's voice from the living room. Not talking to him, talking with the particular freedom of someone who believes they are alone. She was on the phone with her friend Lauren. The volume was not low. He stopped in the hallway. He stood there for 11 minutes. He heard her describe the divorce she was planning with the specificity of someone who had been thinking about it for a long time. He heard her talk about the real estate, 4 properties all in his name, the investment accounts, the business he had spent 14 years building. He heard her describe the settlement she expected to walk away with. He heard her laugh, and then he heard her say, "I'm going to destroy him, Lauren. Completely. By the time I'm done, he won't have anything left to show for those 14 years except the receipt." More laughter. Daniel stood in the hallway. He did not make a sound. He turned around. He walked back out the side door. He sat in his car for 20 minutes. And then he drove back to his office because he had work to do. What his wife, Sandra, did not know, what she had no way of knowing, was that Daniel had heard a similar conversation 8 months earlier. Not on the phone, in person. And he had not sat in his car for 20 minutes. He had called his attorney the same evening, and in the 8 months since that call, Daniel had been very, very busy. Like this video right now. Those likes matter, and you know it. Hit the button. Subscribe too, completely free. Drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching from. Now let me take you back to the beginning of what Daniel built while Sandra was planning to take it apart. Daniel Hartwell was 42 years old and had built Hartwell Properties and Holdings, from a single office suite in a rented building to a company that now managed commercial and residential property assets across 4 states. He had not done this quickly. He had done it the way he did everything. Methodically, without announcement, with the patience of someone who understood that visible success attracted the wrong kind of attention, and that the most durable things were built before anyone was watching. He had grown up in a family without money, not the romantic kind, without money, that produces interesting backstory, but the grinding, limiting, pragmatic kind that teaches you how to think carefully before you spend, to read what you sign, and to trust people only after they have demonstrated they deserve it. He had trusted Sandra. She was 40 years old, smart in the specific way of someone who had studied how power moved in rooms and learned to position herself near it. She was beautiful in a way that she was aware of and used well. She had married Daniel at 32 when his company was established but not yet remarkable, and she had been, for the first several years, a genuine partner, present, supportive, interested in the work. Then the work had grown, and as the company's profile had expanded, Sandra's relationship to it had shifted in the way that relationships sometimes shift when the thing being built becomes visibly valuable. She had become more interested in what the company represented than in the work of building it, more interested in the properties and the portfolios and the accounts than in the decisions and the problems and the 14-year accumulation of choices that had produced them. Daniel had noticed this shift. He had noticed it gradually, the way you notice temperature changes, each degree unremarkable, the cumulative movement significant. He had also noticed, 8 months before the hallway, something more concrete. The conversation he had overheard 8 months earlier was between Sandra and a man named Brian. Brian was 44, ran a consulting firm, and had been present at several events in Daniel's professional world over the preceding 2 years. Daniel had noticed him as a peripheral figure, the kind of person who circulated through certain rooms without being central to any of them. He had not noticed Brian as anything else until a Tuesday evening when he had come home and heard voices in the study. Sandra's study, the room she used when she worked from home, and had assumed she was on a call and had not paid attention, until he heard the laugh. It was a specific laugh, the kind that belongs to a private world rather than a professional one, the kind that you recognize immediately, even if you've never heard it in that context before. He had stopped in the hallway. He had heard enough to understand the shape of what was happening. He had gone to the kitchen. He had made himself a drink. He had waited until the conversation ended. He had said nothing when Sandra came to find him. He had sat with it for 3 days. Then he had called his attorney, a woman named Patricia Walsh, who had handled the company's legal affairs for 7 years and who had, over those 7 years, become one of 2 people Daniel trusted without qualification. He had told her what he needed. She had said, "Tell me everything, and let me tell you what's possible." Patricia Walsh was 51 years old, meticulous, and possessed of the specific quality that distinguishes excellent attorneys from good ones. She did not tell her clients what they wanted to hear. She told them what was accurate, and then helped them navigate from the accurate position. She had listened to Daniel's account on a Thursday evening in her office after her other appointments were done. She had asked 3 questions. Then she had said, "If you're thinking about what I think you're thinking about, the timing is everything, and we need to start immediately." Daniel had said, "I know." She had said, "There are legal constraints on what can be done once divorce proceedings are filed. Everything needs to be in place before that happens." "I understand," he said. "Daniel, this has to be completely clean. Every transfer, every restructuring, it has to be legitimately motivated by business logic, properly documented, and in place long enough that it doesn't look like divorce preparation. Because if it looks like divorce preparation, it becomes fraudulent transfer." "What's the timeline?" he said. 6 months minimum," she said. 8 is better." Daniel had looked at her. "I have 8 months," he said. What Daniel did in the 8 months between that Thursday evening and the night he stood in the hallway and heard Sandra's phone call was, in the strict legal sense, entirely legitimate. It was also extraordinarily thorough. The first thing Patricia did was bring in a financial restructuring specialist named Marcus Webb, who had spent 25 years helping companies reorganize their asset structures for business purposes. The restructuring of Hartwell Properties and Holdings had a genuine business rationale. Daniel had been planning an expansion into a new market, and the reorganization created a more appropriate legal architecture for that expansion. The expansion was real. The new market was real. The reorganization served genuine business purposes. It also, as a consequence of being properly executed with appropriate timing, resulted in Daniel's personal ownership of the company's most valuable assets being held through a series of entities that were correctly structured, legally defensible, and technically not his in the way that his assets might be understood by a spouse's divorce attorney working from a personal financial statement. Property 1, the main commercial portfolio, was transferred into a business entity that had been established with appropriate capitalization and a genuine operating purpose, owned by a holding company in which Daniel held a minority interest through a legitimately structured trust. Property 2 through 4 followed similar patterns, each with its own business logic, each with documentation that Marcus's team produced with the thoroughness that Patricia's instructions required. The investment accounts were restructured through legitimate tax and estate planning moves that Daniel's financial advisor, a woman named Carol, had been recommending for years and that he had not previously acted on. The business itself, the operating company, the one with the revenue and the staff and the 14 years of relationships, was reorganized into a structure that involved a management company in which Daniel's role was executive rather than ownership-based, with actual ownership held through instruments that were legally clean and personally removed. What remained in Daniel's personal name, the assets that a standard financial discovery process in a divorce would surface first, was a primary residence, 2 vehicles, a personal checking account, and the liability side of several business obligations that had been legitimately assumed as part of the restructuring. Net personal position, on paper, negative. Daniel had sat across from Marcus and Patricia in a conference room 6 weeks before the hallway evening, looking at the restructured financial picture. "This is where you are," Marcus said. "Personal balance sheet shows a net liability position. The business interests are held through entities that are yours in substance, but which require significant legal work to reach through in a divorce proceeding. And if Sandra's attorneys try to reach them," Daniel said. "They can try," Patricia said. "The structures are clean. The documentation is solid. The timing is right. We're 8 months from the initial transfers. A judge would need a compelling reason to conclude fraud, and there isn't one, because there wasn't fraud. But it will take time for them to understand what they're looking at, Marcus said. By the time they do, the case will be over, Daniel said. Marcus looked at Patricia. Patricia looked at Daniel. That's the idea, she said. That was 6 weeks before the hallway. After the hallway, Daniel did 2 things. He called Patricia and said, "She's filing soon." I could hear it in the conversation. "We need to be ready." Patricia said, "We've been ready for 6 weeks." The second thing he did was go back inside his house the following morning and continue his life as normally as he could manage, because the one thing he could not afford was to give Sandra any reason to suspect that anything had changed in his position. He was good at this. He had always been good at the composure that hides the work underneath. Sandra filed on a Wednesday morning, 3 weeks after the hallway conversation. Her attorney was named Robert Kinsley, who had a reputation in their city's legal community for aggressive divorce litigation and substantial wins in high-asset cases. Sandra had clearly selected him carefully. Kinsley filed immediately for a comprehensive financial disclosure from Daniel. Daniel's attorneys provided it. The disclosure was complete, accurate, and legal. It showed a personal balance sheet with a net liability position. Kinsley had called Patricia the afternoon of the disclosure. She had answered with the professional pleasantness of someone who expected the call. Kinsley had said, with the controlled incredulity of a man who has been misled about the nature of his case, "There must be additional assets not represented here." Patricia had said, "Everything is disclosed. I'd be happy to walk you through the documentation." There was a pause on the line. "We'll be conducting our own discovery," Kinsley said. "Of course," Patricia said warmly. "We look forward to cooperating fully." Like this video right now, this is building to something extraordinary, and that like button needs to be hit before we get there. Do it. Subscribe if you haven't. Drop your comment. Where in the world are you watching from? Now, watch what happens when Kinsley finds the business entities. Kinsley's financial investigators found the entities within 3 weeks. This was expected. The structures were not designed to be invisible. They were designed to be defensible. Hidden assets were fraudulent transfer. Legitimately structured business entities with appropriate documentation were not. Kinsley filed a motion arguing that the restructuring represented an attempt to shelter marital assets from the divorce proceeding. Patricia filed the response. She provided the documentation, the timeline, the business rationale, the market expansion plans that had predated the divorce filing by 11 months, the legitimate tax and estate planning recommendations that had been on record for 2 years before implementation. The judge reviewed the motion. She denied it. Kinsley requested a hearing. The hearing was scheduled. Sandra had understood approximately 4 weeks into the discovery process that something was wrong with her model of the situation. She had gone to Robert Kinsley's office, an office she had attended twice a week for the past 2 months, each time receiving updates that had been progressively less satisfying, and she had asked him directly, "What's happening?" Kinsley was a careful man who chose his words with the precision of someone who understood that how you delivered bad news was almost as important as the news itself. He said, "The assets you described to me when we first met, the real estate portfolio, the investment accounts, the business value, they exist. But they're held through entities that are not in Daniel's personal name. They've been restructured over the past 8 months through transactions that the court has thus far found to be legitimate." Sandra stared at him. "What does that mean?" she said. "It means that what we can reach in the divorce settlement is significantly less than what you anticipated," Kinsley said. "The personal financial picture is, his attorneys have provided documentation showing a net liability position." "He doesn't have a liability position," Sandra said. "He has properties and accounts, and not in his personal name," Kinsley said. "Not anymore." Sandra sat very still. "When did this happen?" she said. Kinsley consulted his notes. "The first transfers were approximately 8 months ago," he said. The final hearing was on a Wednesday morning in February. Sandra sat at the plaintiff's table with Kinsley on her left and a second attorney on her right. She wore the composed expression of someone who has been told to project confidence regardless of how she feels. Daniel sat at the defendant's table with Patricia and Marcus. He wore a dark suit. He had a glass of water in front of him that he touched occasionally but did not drink from. He was looking at the papers in front of him when Sandra walked in, and he did not look up. The judge, a methodical woman named Judge Patricia Davis, reviewed the financial disclosure, the discovery documents, and the competing filings from both sides. She asked questions of both attorneys. She reviewed Kinsley's fraud argument and Patricia's rebuttal. She took a 40-minute recess. When she returned, she ruled. The personal assets in Daniel's name, the residence, the vehicles, the checking account, were subject to equitable division. The business entities were not. The restructuring had been completed before the divorce filing with legitimate business rationale, and the court found no basis for fraudulent transfer. The settlement Sandra received was a number that Kinsley delivered to her in a low voice as the hearing concluded. She looked at him. "That's it?" she said. He said nothing. She looked across the room at Daniel, who was speaking quietly with Patricia, the papers in front of him organized and settled. She looked at the number again. She had told Lauren she was going to destroy him completely. She had fought for 14 years of his work. She had received a fraction of what a year of it had produced. The management company Daniel held through the restructured entities continued to operate. The commercial portfolio continued to generate revenue. The expansion into the new market, the one that had provided the business rationale for the restructuring, proceeded on the timeline Marcus had outlined. 3 months after the hearing, Hartwell Properties and Holdings announced the opening of its new regional office, the first step in a market expansion that had been planned for 14 months. Daniel's name was on the announcement. He had chosen, for the announcement, to step back into public visibility in a way he had not been visible during the 11 months of restructuring, not as a statement, because the business required it and the timing was right. The business press covered the expansion with the interest that a well-established company's growth typically attracted. Sandra read the coverage. She was living in an apartment that she had leased with the settlement funds. She had not spoken to Brian since shortly after the divorce filing, a development that she would not have anticipated and which had arrived with the specific, devastating clarity of someone's understanding too late. The difference between a person who finds you attractive in a particular context and a person who would reorganize their life around you. She had called Lauren. Lauren had been less enthusiastic about discussing the situation than she had been 11 months ago when the plan had seemed so clear. Sandra sat in her apartment with the coverage of the Hartwell expansion open on her screen. She thought about the phone call from 11 months ago, the laughing, the plan, the certainty. She thought about the hallway, though she didn't know about the hallway. She didn't know that Daniel had been standing there. She didn't know what he had heard or what he had done about it. She didn't know about the 8 months. She just knew the outcome. Daniel moved to another city, not fleeing. The new regional office was there. The expansion required his presence. It was a business decision with genuine operational logic. He had also, in the months since the hearing, been doing something he had not permitted himself to do, while the restructuring and the proceedings had consumed his attention. He had been spending time with a woman named Claire. Claire was 39, a structural engineer who worked on commercial construction projects which had brought her into the orbit of Daniel's company through a project partnership that began as professional and had developed with the careful, unhurried pace that genuine things develop when neither person is in a rush. She knew the full history. He had told her, not early, not until they both understood that what was happening between them was real, but he had told her everything. The discovery, the restructuring, the hearing, the outcome. She had listened with the same quality of attention she brought to structural assessments, complete, without rushing to conclusions, willing to sit with complexity. She had said, "Did you do anything that wasn't completely legal?" He had said, "No." She had thought about it. "Did you do anything that wasn't completely fair?" He had sat with that one. "I protected what I built," he said, "from someone who was planning to take it while I was building it. Whether that's fair depends on how you define fair." She had nodded slowly. "Okay," she said. They had not discussed it again in the way of people who have resolved something and moved on. The new office opened on a Thursday. Daniel stood in front of it that morning, the way he had stood in front of every building that had carried the company name over 14 years. Just for a moment, just the way you stand in front of something you've built when you want to feel the fact of it. Claire was beside him. She said, "Ready?" he said. Yes, they went inside. The team was there. People he had worked with for years, people new to the expansion, people who knew the company's history, and people who were beginning to learn it. He thanked them for the work. He told them about the next phase. He was precise and specific and grounded in the way of someone who had been doing this for 14 years and intended to keep doing it. After the meeting, he went to his office and worked. The office had a window that looked out over the city, a different city than the one he had spent 14 years in. But cities are more similar than their residents usually acknowledge. And what mattered about the view was that it was his, and the work that faced the window was his, and the building it was in was his in every sense that counted. He opened his laptop. He began working on the next thing. Like this video, if Daniel's story did something for you today, that like button is right there and costs nothing and matters. Hit it. Share this with someone. Subscribe if you're not already. The next story is already being made, and you want to be there. See you then. Sandra had bet her friends she would destroy him. Daniel had heard her make that bet and had already been building his response for 8 months. 2 people. Same game. One of them had read the rules. One hadn't. Here's what I want you to think about. Daniel's restructuring was legal. Every transfer was documented, justified by real business logic, and found legitimate by the court. He did nothing wrong in the strict sense. But he did it in response to hearing something, and then spent 8 months playing a strategic game while continuing to live as if nothing had changed. Is that justice? Or is it the same thing Sandra was doing, just executed better? And here's the harder question. If you found out your partner was planning what Sandra was planning, would you fight back the way Daniel did? Or would you just leave? Tell me in the comments. Real answer only. Tell me where you're watching from. Like this video. If Daniel's story did something for you today, that like button is right there and costs nothing and matters. Hit it. Share this with someone. Subscribe if you're not already. The next story is already being made and you want to be there. See you then.